Good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to an evening at Gaia. My name is Jing Yi, a third-year accountancy student studying at Nanyang Business School, and I'm very pleased to be an MC this evening. A gentle reminder to please switch your mobile phone and electronic devices to silent mode if you have not already done so. This panel discussion will be recorded for informational, educational, and marketing purposes. The recording will be hosted on YouTube and will be made available for viewing on our website. A write-up on the session will also be made available for you together with the recording. Please note that the copyright of the recording and write-up shall belong to NTU. The theme of this evening, NBS Knowledge Lab Distinguished Panel is Shaping the Future, Sustainability and Business Transformation. Now it is my honor to invite our distinguished panelists and moderator on stage to begin our panel discussion. First up, may we invite Mr. Tan Chong Meng, Group CEO at PSA International. Next, Mr. Damian Chan, Executive Vice President of Policy, Planning and Strategy at EDB. Mr. Dave Sivaprasad, Managing Director and Partner, Southeast Asia Lead for Climate and Sustainability at BCG. Guiding our discussion today, we have our moderator, Professor Fong, Deputy Dean of Nanyang Business School. At any point in time, if our audience would like to ask any questions for our moderators on stage, please feel free to scan this QR code presented on stage and submit your questions, which will be used for the Q&A later on. Now, I'll pass my time on to Prof. to begin the panel discussion.
Thank you. All right, so welcome everyone. Welcome to our alumni, our guests, our faculty and students. So it's a great honor to be moderating this very distinguished panel. Let me introduce our speakers. So first of all, we have Mr. Tan Chong Meng. So Chong Meng is the Group CEO of PSA International. He also serves as the Chairman of JTC Corporation, and he also assumes the role of Governor Chair for the World Economic Forum's Supply Chain and Transport Industry Community. And this is only a small snapshot of the many things that he's doing, right? So we're very glad to have Chong Meng with us to actually share about his experience and what PSA is actually doing, especially in this sustainability journey. Next, we have Mr. Damian Chan. Damian is the Executive Vice President of the Singapore Economic Development Board. So he oversees EDB's policy and planning group and strategy divisions, including agri-food, advanced manufacturing, environmental sustainability, hub services, and supply chain and connectivity. So clearly he has the expertise and will be sharing with us the policy angle and perspectives related to sustainability. Last but not least, we have Mr. Dave Sivaprasad. Dave is the Managing Director and Partner at BCG, leading the firm's climate and sustainability practice in Southeast Asia. So he has many decades of experience in the sustainability domain, and I guess he's the one who's living and breathing sustainability every day, right? So very glad to have Dave with us, especially since we actually work together on the BCG program, right? So the first thing I wanted to have some sense from the panelists is really this idea of sustainability, and in particular, today we are looking at environmental sustainability as a business imperative, right? So is it really the case that sustainability has actually evolved from being just like a corporate responsibility, something nice to have, to something that is critical to have as a strategic business imperative? So maybe Chong Meng, you could share with us a little bit. Let us know how PSA has integrated sustainability into its core strategy and to what extent it has really become a business imperative.
Right, Fong, thank you. And first of all, thank you for having me. And I want to congratulate you on having such a wonderful building, the largest wood-based building, and I love wood, basically. My house similar as well, but not like this, of course. Well, I would say sustainability, and in particular environmental sustainability, is probably the most urgent and important subject that is being discussed in the world today. And in supply chain, which came to attention during COVID because everybody was concerned that supply chain wasn't working. People used to delegate supply chain procurement to the procurement office, and the board doesn't want to hear about it except give me the lowest price. And then, of course, it became important, and now the question is it sustainable? I think people start to realize, because supply chain is only one part of the total emissions challenge in the world, start to realize that the way that we've grown our population and then conduct our affairs and all that, manufacturing, production, consumption, it's something that cannot persist in the same form and fashion. But for a business, most business start out through time not having sustainability as a driver. I'll confess to that. Because if you look at PSA, it's 50 years old. What has been its driver of growth and profitability and success? Global trade growth. We're in a part of the world where the track record as well as the future outlook is one where we are a big part of driving global growth. China, for one, over 30 years from 1990 to 2020, the manufacturing value add of China to the global manufacturing value was from 3% to 30% in 30 years. And that is reflected in the goods that are shipped. We grew on that. In the 50 years, we went from 0 to about 40 million 20-foot equivalent units in Singapore. And PSA went from also 0 to now about 100 million 20-foot equivalent units. That is one operation out of every 10 in the world. So now we have 66 locations globally. You may not be aware of that because everybody knows Singapore, but not the other 65. Right? So the driver has been about growth together alongside the world. And the other driver of growth for most companies have been efficiency, competitiveness, and on that score, technology has played a big part. From the 1970s, 1980s, we have had the benefit of better and better electromechanical technologies, and then after that, computing, and of course, digital. And the last 5-10 years, IR 4.0 has been a race towards digital twins, knowing our business better. As the form factor of trade and shipping and everything all changes to larger is better, you need technology to help us to keep things under control. And then, of course, all this have created a rapid acceleration in terms of the transportation options. Now, here comes the problem. For about 20 years, since China entered WTO, the container trade actually supports most of the trade. Bulk trade is a small proportion. Container trade is dominant part. Container-based trade grew at 2 to 3 times GDP growth rate. So to support 1% of global GDP growth, container trade growth has to go up 2 to 3 times. So if you have an apple, it comes from many countries before it's finally assembled and sent to you as a product. In any container that you open, 60 to 70% of the time, you see an unfinished product. You see a screen, you see a backing, but you don't see the phone. So it's only in the 30% of the time. So the world has become a global factory, and the container has been used as the cheap resource to enable that globalization to take place. So for 20 years, we reveled in globalization. It was great, and we created growth, but we actually have been consuming another resource, which is energy. So for the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen a change from this 2 to 3 times multiplier to more like 1. So the world has become more dependent on services for growth, but at the same time, I believe there's a slow pace of drive for optimization that's going on. Now, we see that as a company, and we certainly are embracing all these demands for better sustainable solutions from our customers to provide 3 things. One is better understanding of their processes and providing them with solutions that will change their carbon footprint. That's scope 3 for us, but scope 1 and scope 2 for them. Now, on that scope, we can discuss some examples and details later. The second aspect is the transport itself, low carbon transport. Aviation, marine, and shipping and land transport accounts for about 20% of our total global emissions, of which half of that is for commercial transport. So that's quite big. If you look at it from that perspective, and if you talk about buildings and all that, that's outside of that 20%, right? So this is just what we use to ship things and move ourselves. The expectation is that we in supply chain must take responsibility for decarbonizing that transport mode, whether it's a truck or a ship, and that's what we're working furiously on as well. And then the third area is to be a part of ensuring that there is the green molecule for all these transportation requirements. Because unlike utility, which you can power with previously coal and then gas, transport requires a liquid product. It's not so, and that's where fossil comes in. Fossil is required in a sticky manner because of transport. And so the whole transportation supply chain industry, like this WEF and all, we are trying to find a way towards bringing the whole community towards adopting, embracing, producing, and using new fuels, without which net zero cannot take place. So that's just a very high-level introduction.
Right. Thank you so much, Chong. So I guess what I hear is really the fact that growth is just as much of an imperative as sustainability. And it's really about how to manage that. And I guess what I hear is, at the same time that you are trying to make things more efficient, it's both helping the growth and also trying to reduce the energy consumption.
Yeah, sustainable trade. You want both.
Yeah. So I think that's really important. So maybe moving on to Damian, right? I think it's often said that this battle for net zero will be won and lost in Asia. So being strategically situated in Asia Pacific, Singapore can hopefully play a strategic role and crucial role in driving climate action. So I was wondering whether you could help us to understand what Singapore is doing to transition its economy to this low carbon future, especially with the context of what Chong has said, that obviously firms also need to bear in mind the need for growth.
Thanks, Fong. I think it goes without saying, and in fact, PM has said this a few years ago, that for us, climate change and decarbonization is a national priority, and he has put it up there at the same level as our own defense, right? Yeah. But at the same time, it is not so much about just what Singapore does, but what other countries do. Singapore, our carbon emissions accounts for only 0.1% of global emissions, right? But at the same time, we were actually a bit late compared to other countries in announcing a net zero by 2050 goal, right? But the difference is this, that when the Singapore government announces any targets, compared to most other countries, is that we usually have, not necessarily, especially if we talk about something in 2050, a very definitive path, but we at least have some, we know that there are possibilities and pathways which can achieve that. I think many countries which had announced 2050 net zero targets compared to Singapore actually do not have that inkling. In fact, many of them are starting to realize what the costs are, and you start seeing a bit more of that rollback. Yeah. So that was one reason why we took a bit longer, only early last year when we announced the net zero by 2050. But we have a clear idea of doing. I'll speak a bit about that later. But for us, we are very serious when we announce this target, because it's not just so much about us reducing our emissions, but we need to have the moral authority to be able to then influence other countries, right, much bigger than us, right, on the global stage, on multilateral fora, right, to then take their own targets seriously, and that is what's going to make the big difference. But in order to do that, then we need to walk our talk, right? So that's why then it is very important, it's imperative for Singapore to decarbonize. And us in EDB, right? EDB, we are leading in the We are the lead government agency in Singapore when it comes to industry development, looking after all of manufacturing, as well as many of the exportable services sectors, so roughly about 35% of Singapore's GDP. Manufacturing accounts for roughly slightly over 20% of Singapore's GDP, but in terms of carbon emissions, it accounts for 60%, about 60%, right? So there's no way in which Singapore can get anywhere close to any significant decarbonization without decarbonizing our manufacturing sector, and that's where I spend a lot of my time, looking at decarbonization strategies, whether it is then decarbonizing our energy and chemicals industry, which is the single sector which contributes the most. Chong actually used to be working for ExxonMobil in Singapore. Oh, Shell.
Wrong color.
Oh, Shell, sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Shell, ExxonMobil, these two are actually very large contributors to our energy and chemicals industry. And over there, that's where it is the big needle mover, and that's where I spend a lot of my time working with these oil majors to see how then we can both decarbonize their operations, but also work with them to provide solutions which can help decarbonize other sectors, including, let's say, the maritime sector. Because it is these companies which are then also at the same time while decarbonizing or basically trying to atone for their sins, but help others also hopefully atone for their sins as well by providing the cleaner fuels, right, for maritime, for aviation, and so on, right? So, but at the same time, the policy levers we can use is not so straightforward. It's very easy to say, then you just have a high carbon tax, you price the carbon in, and then the market will work accordingly, right? But it is not a level playing field. Unfortunately, Singapore, we are still the only country in Southeast Asia which has a meaningful carbon tax, which we will be increasing to $25 next year, and by 2030, $50 to $80. We need to balance between providing companies the incentive to decarbonize and balancing that with competitiveness, because it is definitely not good for Singapore from an economic perspective if companies just relocate, shut down their operations because of the high cost from the carbon tax. It's also not good for the environment if they shut down and they relocate their refineries, their petrochemical plants just next door or somewhere else in the world, and they end up emitting the same amount or maybe even more, right? So that's why, and this problem is called carbon leakage. So we need to have that fine balance. So this is something which is critical for us. The Singapore government, as part of our green plan, we have also announced a sustainable Jurong Island plan, for instance, for which then part of it is including developing solutions to have more carbon capture, utilization and storage capacity in Singapore by 2050, in fact, going to 6 million tons per annum. I think we can do more. There should be more announcements coming up there. And also then getting the companies there to produce more sustainable products like biofuels to support, let's say, aviation or sustainable aviation fuel, for instance. Yeah.
All right,
Okay.
Thanks, Damian.
Thanks.
Sounds like you have your job cut out for you, yeah, trying to decarbonize our manufacturing sector for Singapore. So moving on to Dave, I'm sure I don't have to ask you about whether sustainability is imperative, because you are actually consulting firms on that all the time. But I thought maybe I could ask you to, given your very wide exposure to a number of industries, if you could sort of look forward, and can you share your thoughts about how this concept of sustainability might actually evolve looking forward, in terms of, are there other risks that companies should also be paying attention to?
Well, thanks, Fong, and thank you also for the kind invitation to participate, and for the collaboration with BCG. Our 70 folks that joined you really left with a fantastic experience. So thank you to NTU and the business school for that. At the risk of adding more complexity to this already complex problem, and you described how complex it is on the supply chain side and on the decarbonization in Singapore with the industry. This is certainly multifaceted and highly complex, and part of the challenge is that we can't predict the future, right? We have fantastic scientists, some of them, in NTU that do great work on modeling, some of the outcomes, but we don't know, right? We don't know how these are going to play out. So there's certainly a pathway that industries will take on, a 1.5 degree, which is, what is going to be debated and engaged and, negotiated in the next COP and so on. But despite our best efforts, we're still quite far away, right? So that raises the agenda on how do you prepare for all the physical hazards that will come. And particularly in our part of the world, in Southeast Asia, we are one of the most exposed globally to storms, to floods, to extreme heat, and so on. So as you look ahead to that question of looking ahead, across sectors and across businesses, and also with governments, the question of how do you adapt and build resilience will be a big topic of focus, and increasingly so. The other aspect that we'll see some of this also, leading up to COP28 and so on, is that the climate topic is multifaceted, and there's increasing recognition of the systemic impacts that exist, and nature and biodiversity is another one, right? Now, certainly nature and preserving nature has a big part to play in our pathway towards a 1.5 degree world. It also plays a big part in regulating our environment and our climate, and building resilience for us. Now, what does that then mean for businesses? If you notice in September, there was the release of TNFD. So this is the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures. And the reason I mention that is that the notion of climate risk, probably 2009, 2010, TCFD would have come up. You may be familiar with this. It was released in 2015. Took 5 years for engagement and so on. And this is now the standard of disclosures that investors look at. TNFD, which is nature-related disclosures, it was accelerated. It came out in 2 years, right? And it's an illustration of how the world has moved on, has understood some of these interconnected challenges, and is moving on it. And I'll illustrate this with one example of what it means for business. So we worked with a very large biopharma industry company, and their climate-related risk versus their nature-related risks. Their nature-related risks were 3 times larger than their climate-related risks. Now, if you think about that for a second, right? Think of all the impacts that you would have from heat, storms, physical impact, and so on. And then the nature-related risk, because you're reliant on water, on fresh air, on genetic material, this is dramatic, right? And pharma is not the only one. I mean, think about food systems. Think about, many parts of our resource-intensive industries. So there are these interconnected factors that will increasingly become important, and businesses will need to pay attention to it. So now, what does that mean for any given business in any sector? As disclosures increase, the expectation from investors increase, as governments at different pace, start taking action, drive policy. If you're sitting in Southeast Asia, and if you have trade interests to other parts of the world, those expectations on policy and disclosures will start to hit you. So if you're a business today, what we're finding is that it's really important to understand all those implications. Now, when you move and how you move and where you invest, you may phase out over time. But understanding those implications at this stage, we think is really, really important. I'll stop there. I didn't want to add more complexity. It's already a complex issue, but that's what we see looking ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So sounds like there's a lot for us to worry about, right? We have to worry about climate risks. We have to worry about nature risks. We have to worry about regulations that might change and what that means for businesses. So I think while it's quite clear that for some companies, sustainability is a business imperative, but also at the same time, we've seen cases where countries or even companies sort of renege or go backwards, right, in terms of their commitment. In fact, one of our very promising researchers, Serene, she had a study and she actually found that investment firms that commit themselves to this responsible investing group, this PRI. And what she found was that when they are in trouble, they tend to abandon their public sustainability commitment very quickly. And when they do so, they actually reallocate more of their assets towards what she calls sin stocks, right? And actually that gives them better returns. So, I mean, this is an unfortunate sort of reality, but I just wanted to hear your views of what do we do in this state where clearly it is important, but yet some are actually choosing to go backwards. Chong?
Can I pick up on that? I mean,
Yes.
Unfortunately, it's true, and I think the world is confronted with all kinds of challenges and not science-based. It's people's view. It's my country is more important than your country. Then it gets floated up into politics and so on and so forth. So the human angle is fundamentally the most important one. Yeah, we conceive, we create, and we try to solve problems from our hopefully multilateral perspective, but more often than not, it is not the case. So the last report by UN is that of the so many SDG goals that were set up for delivery by 2030 over the 15-year span, 85% move backwards. Only 15% are on par or moving forward. So if you look at Damian talk about finding new fuels. New fuels are chicken and egg. So even ammonia, the one that we are trying to find solutions for and use Singapore as a game starter, you go and search for the production, they are not there yet, and they say demand is not there yet. So we have to continue to build. While that is going on, indeed, there are ripple effects. So arable land throughout the world has reduced, not increased over the last 15 years, 10 to 15 years, So there are very, I would say, worrying trends. And I sometimes feel that because just like ice doesn't melt progressively, melts at a single temperature, we could get to a point where things suddenly accelerate and people will sit up and take notice. What do we need? I think what we need is like what Dave said, for firms to be held accountable, but held accountable in the science and well-verified, reported way. And that's not something we have now. Yes, TCFD is a reference, but it is not a very precise reference. You can't sign a contract on TCFD. So based on TCFD, it's still not that commercial to be able to support day-to-day transactions. So when do we get to a point where transactions have not just a monetary value, but a carbon result value that is linked to the commercial outcome? We are asking our suppliers to fill in credentials of themselves, and pretty soon the number of pages go to like 50, 70, even 100. Others will ask us to fill in as well. We cannot afford that. We can't afford to create an industry of confusion just to solve simple problems. We need to report the simple outcomes that effectively point towards whether we are solving the problem or we're getting worse. And then we can decide. So that's what's missing. Yeah, and then linking to carbon tax. Carbon tax is great, but it is still not a point of reference for everybody to be able to make investment judgments on a global scale. As for global companies like ourselves, you can literally put a different carbon tax in different countries. And then you have jurisdictions like EU that says, okay, I'm going to set up Fit for 55, a number of different measures, ETS being one, carbon border adjustment mechanism being another, and then they will have backlash. Why should I keep paying you, right? So I think we have set an ambition on 1.5%. The truth is, I think we are going to overshoot. Then how do we create an urgent environment for being able to know as much of what is in fact happening, and then actually make that commercial? Because I don't see any other way, frankly, of moving the whole world in unison than a commercially referenced solution.
Well, I'm sure you guys want to respond. I guess he's saying that maybe some of this complex reporting is too complex, and then what is this role of some of these policies like carbon tax? Yeah. Damian, you want to?
In the same report is human rights.
Yeah, actually carbon tax, if you ask me, doesn't really play that much into it, at least not at this stage. In the ideal world, it should, where then other countries, the whole world is unified towards an objective of having global carbon pricing. That would actually make a lot of difference, right? But we are very far from that, right? What we are trying to make headway in, both at a multilateral level, and this is where, I think, there can be a difference made, right? Despite all this reneging and everything, and it needs both public and private sector, right? So on the public sector side of things, then they need to, have whether a carrot or stick, but they need to have the right policies in place. Like in the US, obviously, they are very heavy on the carrot side of things, where they are just throwing a lot of, they call it tax credits, but it's really grants ultimately, because these are refundable tax credits, the IRA or the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really the biggest misnomer in terms of any government policy I've ever heard in my life. Right? While the EU is really more of a regulatory approach, right? So that's more of a stick approach, while in Singapore we are trying to do both a carrot and stick, where we have a carbon tax, and then we say that or not just say, but the carbon tax collection is used to then support companies for their decarbonization investments at the same time. Right. So government needs to then move in that direction. Also, there are other regulations which Singapore is also trying to do in terms of then having more mandating climate-related disclosures. Firstly, for listed companies, then there are plans also to expand that to the larger private companies as well. Right. But the private sector, at least in terms of where there are non-profits, non-government related, so things like related to IFRS, so governing bodies and global associations are trying to set standards for at least starting with ESG reporting standards. So ISSB, International Sustainability Standards, is one such movement, right? And as these things hopefully get more accepted, not just by corporates, but also by governments, then that would also then hopefully drive more of the movement. I mean, in Singapore, as part of the mandatory climate disclosures, we are referencing some of these standards like ISSB. Sorry, Dave.
Thanks. Fully agree. So
actually the subtext, I think what he's saying is there are consultants earning from all this complex reporting.
Thankfully, we don't get into reporting and disclosures and compliance in at least in our professional services. I would say that in our current free market context and in the way our capital markets work, without commercial incentives, you're not going to get the scale. It's just not going to happen, right? So there is the despair or the hope view that you can look at it. The despair view will be we need to entirely retune our economic system, right? That's the despair view. The hope view, and I tend to be one, more inclined towards the hope and glass half full, is that ultimately this is, a massive economic, social transformation over time, right? We don't have a lot of time. We need to do it fast, and we have to be very pragmatic about it, right? I mean, I think you just take, each step, and if you move the needle. And let me just illustrate it with the following, right? Let's say before COP26. The world was on a pathway of 4 degrees easily. Now, with the commitments that have come through, with corporate, government, and so on, I think it landed somewhere, 2.6, 3, whatever you can call the number, right? It's filled with uncertainty, but it certainly bent the curve. So, if you take a pragmatic stance at it, and let's just take each problem as it comes and unlock it and move forward, whether that's carbon capture and storage in Singapore, or whether that's regenerative agricultural practice for smallholder farmers, in parts of Asia, let's just hit it and bend the curve. So I think there's that. I think there's also reporting and targets and so on, on the one hand, you can look at it as, these are possibly complex distractions from actually getting things done. On the other hand, you can look at, there are signals in the market of direction of travel, right? And I would tend to think, especially when you think about, general accounting principles and how that have taken decades to be common practice. This will also take time, but we need to accelerate, and we need to have appropriate pricing and commercial incentives to move the needle sector by sector, company by company to take it forward. And certainly government and multilateral action plays a big role in this.
Spoken like a true consultant, right? There's always ways to solve the problem. We just have to unpack it and find the right incentives. Yeah?
Can I follow on that? No, I fully agree, Dave. I think we can't wait for reporting to be the driver. I mean, reporting should help, should assist, and should be a useful yardstick, maybe, yeah. But it should enable commercial clarity as well. But don't wait for that, because I think if we do, then indeed things will be even worse. If you take, for instance, say, very close to us, Jurong Island. Just now, Damian talked about it. You're talking about the industrial processes that take place in Jurong Island. Well, one of those processes is the transportation of products. But for the longest time, the way that we have created things in Singapore, it's become daily practice, is that the production from Jurong Island actually gets trucked to the mainland, staged in a depot or a warehouse, re-transported to a mainline port, which is like PSA, and then after it gets shipped out. So you have 3 lifts and 2 truck moves. And as we all know, the truck is one of the high carbon mile. A few years ago when we saw this, and Jurong Island produces about 480,000 TEUs of products per year. That's like a good size little country around the world, so in terms of volume of products. We decided to improve on a terminal in Jurong Island, make it a barge terminal, and immediately just do shuttle runs, put it on the barge and get it to a mainline terminal. So it's 1 truck, 2 moves, it's intermodal now. And then you get it out with the lowest carbon footprint possible. But there's no reward for that. Because in fact, that is seen as a disservice to all the truck-based business model that we've already created and has been enjoyed by SMEs for many, many years. So who is going to be the arbiter that says that's the right thing to do even though it's punitive? That is previously not the best thing to do, and we encourage the change. So there's a business model as well as an economic pool change. And the thing that will inform it is a carbon currency. Yeah, and we don't have that as yet. We don't have the notion of carbon avoidance. So that is in this area called Scope 4. It is scientifically actually quite correct, but administratively and in terms of rules and regulation, very hard. So it's not been given, I believe, enough attention. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah. And I guess this discussion has started.
By the way, the good news is about half of Jurong Island's production now goes by barge. And that saved a lot of CO2. But I can't claim the credit.
Thanks for your support. It also helps with the fact that we have a shortage of truck drivers as well. So actually it's killing both an environmental as well as a manpower problem.
So I think there are lots of questions actually coming in from the audience, right? So I'm going to try to tackle some of them. And I think I think there's some set of questions very interested in understanding how companies actually deal with the complexity of implementing these COP targets or carbon emission targets. So perhaps, Chong, you want to share, and then maybe Dave as well?
Can you repeat that? What's the difficulty?
Actually, it's asking you how PSA deals with the complexity of implementing COP targets or this carbon emission targets.
Well, actually, the ambitions of COP are at rather high level, and companies are, at this point, really setting their own pace with a reference to what is commonly cited as net zero by 2050. And then the question is, what does that mean? And you've got to do your own inventorization, look at your emissions on at least a scope 1, 2 basis, and make a very, very targeted attempt, a programmatic attempt to reduce that, to bend that curve. For PSA, we have two challenges. One is that we exist in many, many countries, and the choices that are available to transportation in terms of moving to alternative fuel or alternative modes is really one, at this point, limited to electrification. So it's one thing to spend a lot of money for electrification. Another thing to say, after you electrify, so what is the carbon emissions in scope 2 as a result? If you're in a coal-based country, it's one answer. If you're in, say, a renewable or a clean utility-based country, like quite a number of companies in Europe, it is another answer. So as a global company, we actually have to look at what makes sense in each country. And then where is the biggest bang for the buck? The biggest bang for the buck is the one where you put your money in the electrification of assets in a country that has the biggest carbon delta. And what happens if, let's say, it's not Singapore? So, we do have to, in the long run, I think we all want to electrify and get to a reduced carbon footprint. But the way we deploy money, we don't have a limitless amount. So you have to deploy in accordance with our global overall reduction capability, sometimes with choices that may favor some places rather than others. Now, it will be great if we could have, say, recognition of this at a more global level, because CO2 in the air doesn't recognize where it comes from, like what Damian said, right? CO2 leakage. So how can we become more mature at this, that if we electrify in places that makes more sense, meaning that it actually takes place in a country that has lower carbon footprint in the utility, it is better for everybody. But then, based on national reporting, you say it's not helping me. If you're doing it in country B and not in my country, it's not helping me. So, as a global company, I think we are faced with that challenge. The other challenge is that beyond the immediate choices, the future requirements are really, really very much dependent, because we are in transportation, on having good amount of primary renewable fuel. Regardless of whatever vector it comes in, whether it's methanol or ammonia or hydrogen itself, that primary source is important. So in fact, PSA has taken upon itself to be a primary power producer in some countries where the regulations allow. So we're trying to be part of solving the problem by learning how the problem can be solved. We're setting up things like advanced battery centers in order that we can have enough science-based knowledge to dealing with the technologies that are needed in the future. But we all know that these are things that the world will have to adjust over time, fundamentally based on still whether we have enough renewable energy. So that's my two big concerns.
That sounds quite aligned with your view of the need to contextualize as well, right?
Yeah, no, and I think, Chong Meng, you described, brilliantly how companies can practically, implement and bend the curve and progress the net zero agenda. So maybe I'll complement maybe from an organizational perspective. Mm-hmm. So where we have seen this now, either it takes off or it doesn't, is when you really start to change the incentives within a company, right? So, for example, if you have a management team that has, 10% of their compensation associated with, carbon emission intensity reductions over time, right? You start to see the needle move. If you see in a company where internal carbon price is part of the capital allocation process, you start to see shifts in where resources are deployed. And it goes all the way down to frontline operations. So I do a lot of work in the energy industry, and if you have metrics for operations managers, asset managers that take into account the GHG emissions, methane and CO2, you start to see performance improvements that then bend the curve. The one other thing I'd add, and I think it speaks to your point, Chong Meng, about where is it that incentives do align. In every industry that we've worked across in terms of decarbonization, net zero, there is a range between 10, 15, even up to 20% where these are negative abatement levers, right? So by efficiency, energy efficiency, optimization in routes, in terms of operating practices, you actually are better off doing that and getting lower emissions. And very often in the next, immediate term, that's what companies need to focus on, right? Getting where the two objectives align and get those, and they're hard, right? They're not necessarily easy, but that's where you can get the initial movements.
Yeah. So I guess it's about structuring and leveraging on some of these opportunities internationally. I think there's also a series of questions here, and I can see why they're saying this, because a lot of these sort of opportunities of internationally and structuring sounds very costly, right? And so I guess there's some questions about, is this sustainability something only for the rich? I guess you can think about it as rich countries, rich companies, and also questions about, is it really too exorbitant for smaller players in Singapore to actually adopt such initiatives? Maybe we'll start with the policymaker.
From EDB's perspective, I fully agree with you that for smaller companies, we shouldn't be, putting too much focus on, trying to get them to reduce emissions, whether it's scope 1, scope 2, and definitely not scope 3, right? For two reasons. One is smaller companies, because they are small, generally don't contribute much to emissions. And also smaller companies also would have less resources to be able to, and it's not just to directly reduce their emissions, but even things like getting the knowledge, right, to be able to do proper carbon accounting, right, or ESG reporting, right? It's more difficult, but that doesn't mean that the Singapore government is not trying to do anything to help there. I mean, the Enterprise Singapore, which is the agency looking at supporting SMEs, has a $180 million training program for SMEs to help, get them up to speed, at least when it comes to ESG reporting, right? But where the government is, right, and EDB for sure, spending more efforts on is really coming up with both policies as well as creating pathways and platforms for the major emitters, right? Whether it's energy and chemicals, whether it is semiconductor wafer fabs, whether it's data centers, right? All of you talk about, saving paper, but actually every time you're streaming videos and everything, you're actually also contributing to climate change as well, right? So, and it's getting worse with AI as well, right? So that is where our focus on is, and yeah, so I agree there.
I would like to add, I fully agree with that. And, I'd like to add a counterpoint. And that is, while the question says, what are your challenges meeting COP targets? I'd say, frankly, there are also a lot of positives in paying attention to them. It highlights the fact that for the longest time, supply chain is fragmented. Everybody optimized within their own sector. And there's a lot of inefficiencies, just like the example that I gave. And there are also other examples. And I'm very pleased, frankly, today that there are responsible companies who are working with us to model their whole supply chain and realize that in one scenario, like there's this company that has 6 supply centers in Europe and 1,100 receiving centers. And in one scenario, it's 700,000 kilometers road miles, and all the way to the best scenario, which is 300,000 kilometer road miles, or road distance. And this knowledge wasn't available. People were not inquisitive as to the impact they were creating. If it meant that 700,000 kilometers was cheaper, that was the answer. There was no curiosity to say, what is the alternative? And of course, this 300,000 needs some infrastructure, like our Jurong Island terminal, similarly, and so on and so forth. So the willingness to explore, and also examines, in PSA, our own theory about the future of supply chain, and allows us as PSA to grow into an end-to-end supply chain player. Up until 2016, we were very happy to just grow a network of ports. In the last 7 years, we doubled the positions with inland depots and intermodal trade, rail business, and so on. So if you think about that, I think that has a huge positive effect. And I think the credentials have also improved.
Yeah, so it's really to be willing to tackle some of these problems, right? So let me pose one last question, and this is also in line with some of the audience's questions before we move on to the dialogue session with the students. So I guess one of the key things is that I think this is along the lines of what Chong is saying. There's also some positives here. So in a sense, I would like to understand a little bit about what are some of the economic opportunities from sustainability, and what can Singapore do to lead and make a difference in this area, and more importantly also, okay, not more importantly, very importantly, also make commercial sense in doing so, right? Dave, you want to start?
Thanks, Wai Fong, for the question. May I reserve the Singapore perspective to Damian, but maybe it's more broadly. I think from our vantage point, working with different companies and different countries and different sectors and so on, I think the economic opportunities really, one of them is around innovation. You start to see a lot of innovation in different business models, in different ways of doing things. I mean, everything from operational innovation down to entirely new businesses, right? So, and just a couple of examples off the top of the head. I think the business of energy services companies that work with others to optimize their energy usage. I mean, that's growing and it's expected to grow. Now, this is a bit of a dated example, but just to illustrate the point, two-wheeler electric vehicles, with battery swapping as a business model, probably you wouldn't have thought about it 5 years ago, right? So, again, new economic opportunities. Singapore, you were sharing earlier, Damian, all this on plant-based alternatives that are coming up. I mean, certainly it's early days, but you see a lot of innovation in this space that is only expected to increase. So I think, maybe on the more meta sense, right? I think if you put constraints on human beings, we are very creative, right? And we find solutions and we find new ways of doing things. And I think we're seeing that the power of innovation being unleashed because of these constraints that we face.
Great.
I fully agree with Dave there. Even within this region, or maybe especially within this region, there is a lot of scope for carbon reduction projects which are economic. We all know that renewables today, solar, the cost has come down so significantly. It is actually commercial, right? You just need to have government policies which are conducive to it. Unfortunately, in the region, a lot of the price of electricity is still subsidized heavily, and as a result, it's still not that economical unless there's government support. But I think that is slowly changing, right? And we see a lot of now more project development, project financing opportunities for renewables happening in Southeast Asia, and companies setting up at least their regional hubs in Singapore to support such opportunities. That's one. Then the other one beyond just renewables is really the opportunities in the region to have nature-based solutions projects, which then contribute to the decarbonization effort, whether it is avoidance of deforestation, mangroves, and all these kind of projects, for which traditionally people think that this would be driven by voluntary carbon markets, but countries are also seeing that these projects helps them in terms of meeting their own carbon targets. So it is also then becoming, you don't have to rely on voluntary carbon markets thing. I mean, we do know that there has been some discrediting of it in the past few months from the Guardian article for some of the Vera credits, for instance. But for compliance markets, it is still a very viable market, and there are carbon market opportunities. And in Singapore, we've been seeing a lot of companies in the carbon services space to support carbon markets, to support ESG reporting and so on, and measurements, reporting, and verification opportunities too, right, to support these opportunities. Yeah, so yeah, thank you.
Great.
I'd say in the here and now, as I said just now, many companies are more interested in seeing how they can reduce their carbon footprint and also comply with regulations that are upcoming. The example on reducing carbon footprint I've mentioned just now, on complying with future regulations, say like a whole new industry, battery manufacturing. There is the anticipation that by, say, 2030, we'll have 100 gigawatt hour worth of batteries waiting to be dealt with, because they're all in cars now and they age, and we'll have to figure out what to do. So companies that are producing are also trying to figure out what's the best way to deal with it. We support some gigafactories in Europe, and alongside handling their production materials, we're also starting to research and work on, say, how to handle recirculation. And this is just one example. Recyclates in Europe, the requirement is going to go up for the chemical industry. The circular economy is finally going to at least become a little more real in that sector. So these are all new opportunities and new solutions. In the low carbon transport side, in some markets, actually a low carbon mile is cheaper than the conventional mile because you can tap into energy that is cheaper. In India, we produce solar at much less than what we pay the grid. In China as well, so we're in wind power and solar power in China and solar in India. So I think in the here and now, there are indeed projects that are economically viable, even without any imputed carbon tax. But this can only scale if indeed the future economics will also support the same kind of ideas with the amount of energy that is then going to be available at that point in time, a future point in time, which the future tranches of energy may be more expensive. So if you look at the renewable converted to ammonia to methanol, we're still trying to get the world to pay. If we replace all of fossil with all of that, we have to think of, say, an energy cost that is an X multiple of today's cost. Yeah. If there's no choice, I think we can afford it, but I don't think the commercial world will adapt it or accept it without turmoil. Yeah.
All right. Great to hear that there are indeed some opportunities that are out there, right? So there's one question actually for me to ask me, how do NBS students think of sustainability? What are the representative concerns over sustainability from our future business leaders? And I'm so glad that we prepared for this segment because we've already prepped two undergrad students, two of our future business leaders. And we are actually going to invite them to actually share some of their reflections, maybe help to answer this question, and see if you guys have any burning questions for our panelists as well. Yeah, so can you, Kenneth and is it Marcus?
Max,
sorry, can you?
Yeah, so thanks everyone for the insightful sharing. My name is Kenneth, third year banking and finance student at NBS. I actually have quite a few burning questions. I guess the first question I have is with regards to the increasingly bifurcated geopolitical situation in the world, and how do you guys see this as a huge roadblock to pursuing sustainability for the whole world? Then another question I have is actually related to one of the questions posed in the Q&A channel, which is regards to rich versus poor. So this can come to an individual level, but I guess my concern here, also based on my own understanding, is rich countries in the West, like the US, UK, and large part of Europe, they've industrialized over the past like 100 and 200 years, but African nations and even our regional neighbors are trying to catch up. And whether certain sustainability sticks are punitive in helping these countries get to catching up with the rest of the world. Yeah, I think these are the two questions I have for the panel here. Thank you.
Maybe we can direct this question to Damian.
Sure. Thanks. The first question in terms of the geopolitical, the bifurcation, directly, it does not, right? But indirectly, or obviously, I mean, what that kind of fragmentation has led to is, breaking of supply chains, right? And also has contributed to inflation as well, which is always a more clear and present concern for governments. So as a result, then, and especially the more developing emerging nations, then that becomes a more pressing concern for them relative to, so with that, then energy costs increasing and so on, then they are more concerned, right, about keeping cost of living low for their population rather than shutting down coal plants, for instance, right? So in that's the indirect. Now, I guess I won't say light at the end of the tunnel for that, but one thing is that a lot of this geopolitical bifurcation is to do with sectors which are less to do with sustainability. So things to do with semiconductors, AI, right? But if you think about sustainability-related technologies, right, whether it is hydrogen, next generation fuels, and so on, these are not areas which are contested that much, and they don't provide like strategic, at least advantage, and definitely not from a defense perspective, right? And if you notice that when the US talks to China, they don't say that I want to collaborate with you in semiconductors for sure, or in tech-related stuff, but sustainability is one area which Biden always offers to China, right? Yeah, so I think that at least provides some hope there.
Damian, I agree with you in terms of it being indirect as far as policy discussions and leaders at the top, when they engage. That's true, it's a second order effect. But in order to transit to a new energy world, we need a lot of minerals. So it's going to be important to see who has those minerals. The production of energy in the world in the past, the old energy map is lumpy. The new energy map is more distributed. But to enable it to take place and become applied in the societal framework, industrial framework, or setting, you need minerals. From new minerals to even conventional minerals like copper. So you know what I'm talking about, right? So we've got to watch that one, I think. I don't know, what do you think?
And over there, what we're seeing is something which I think is good, which should have been done anyway, that there has been more work to diversify the sources of such minerals. Yeah. Of course, I mean, rare earths is one, but even other things like things which go into the production of batteries and so on. Right? So from that perspective, creating more sources of mining and production, I think is good. Yeah. Yep. For resilience, for climate change.
Yep. So maybe we hear from Max.
Hi, thank you for sharing.
Sorry, for Kenneth, you had a second question, which is on how to, if you like, rationalize the fact that some people have industrialized and enjoy economic growth for a whole century and some others are still not actually up the curve. I think that's a tough one. I mean, it's a tough one and it's beyond my pay grade to give a sensible answer to that. Because where the talks break down, it's always this particular factor.
And this is a very difficult discussion which happens every year during all the UNFCCC discussions, right? Which is about, how does the richer countries compensate the poorer countries for the sacrifices that they have to make from an economic development perspective in order to reduce their carbon emissions.
Yep.
Hi, thank you for sharing. My name is Max, and I'm currently doing accounting and business in NBS. So as a young professional who's looking to make an impact in terms of global sustainability, I'm sure we are all interested to know what you think is the biggest opportunity, and of course the most promising one as well, for undergraduates to pursue after graduation. It would be great to hear more about it from the perspectives of both the public as well as the private sector, as well as from our professional services side. Thank you.
Good question to end off our panel. Talk about opportunities to our students.
Join BCG.
We're opening up the recruitment campus. So maybe I can start. I think you know, and I'll speak in very general terms, right? I think the amount of transformation that needs to happen across sectors and the way we work and the economies that they need to really retune, retool, and so on. I think the opportunities for are enormous, right? For any young professional getting into the workforce. I think, if I may just add one point on this, I would recommend a huge dose of curiosity just to learn and apply. Now I had an engineering background, and I work with many clients that are in highly technical industries, and truly I would say that if you're and I'm just going to give you the engineering example just as an illustration, right? If you're an engineer in any energy intensive industry, this is really like the golden age, right? You need to come up with new solutions that don't exist, and apply your innovation, your technical expertise, collaborate across different disciplines. I think it's a fantastic time.
I fully agree with Dave, and being fully cognizant, I'm talking to a business school here, so it's not engineering related, but I would really encourage all of you to also supplement, your softer business skills, right, with also then, not necessarily be full-fledged engineers, but at least, going a bit more deeper into understanding, about electrons and molecules, which are all important parts of, the whole energy transition journey, right? Because ultimately, all the opportunities we are talking about, it needs to be based on science and technology, right? Yeah, and we mentioned a lot of opportunities, so there's no one single opportunity, but it's really about then making sure that you have the knowledge and the curiosity to continue to learn. Yeah.
I agree with that, and I'll just add one more. I think Singapore will be a great reference case for many countries around us or even further flung on how we can transit to a new economy towards a lower carbon world, both in industrial, in global trade, because we are such a big hub, and in urban settings. And in order to do that, I think what Damian said about being curious about how the science part contributes to it is one. But we've talked less about it today, but I would say the digital and the data part is another. The power of data will rise, because computing power is increasing, and we can ingest lots of data, we can interpret lots of data, and AI, MLMs and all that is helping. So you could say that, I would say in maybe 3, 5, 10 years' time, the way Dave would do his job, the way you do your job, and all that are going to be different. And we hope that some of that difference in the tools and our ability will be applied towards these existential issues.
Right. So on that note, I think I also want to add to that question, because at NTU, we train all our students in the area of sustainability. In fact, they take an interdisciplinary course together with other students for a course that's actually taught by faculty members from the Asian School of Environment as well. So we do believe a lot in this kind of interdisciplinarity. And I think through today's talk, I guess we also learn a lot about the possible opportunities that are there. And it is quite clear to me that it's not just an opportunity in one sector, because we hear from the supply chain, from the policy angle, from the consulting angle, and also from the digital angle, there are lots of opportunities for our students and also for the industry to look at this. I think what is exciting is that this is a new area, and we feel it intensely, because when we launch courses, there's a lot of industry interest about the courses. We also find there's lots of things to learn from our faculty members as we try to keep up in this space. So there's lots of new things to learn and new opportunities to pursue, right? While at the same time, of course, there's lots of risk and complexity for us to manage as well. So on this angle, let us end this panel and give our panelists a huge round of applause.